WWT presents Experts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of WWT Experts. I'm your host, Matthew Coble, as usual. And today I have with us not one, but two experts from Worldwide Technology. In this episode in our four-part series on media entertainment and gaming and how that industry approaches stuff like artificial intelligence, cloud, digital transformation, and today's topic, cybersecurity. So Kyle Lindsey is with us. He's a principal consultant at Worldwide Technology, and he leads our efforts in the media entertainment and gaming industry. So if you want to talk about digital twins, artificial intelligence, VR, AR, infrastructure, really any topic related to that industry, Kyle is your guy. Kate Kuehn is the global head of cyber advocacy at Worldwide Technology. She joined us in early 2024, and she has over 25 years of experience with cybersecurity, technology, and innovative AI strategies. She really enjoys working with clients and teams to make better business security and risk decisions to really drive to those business outcomes organizations seek. So delighted to have them both with us today, and welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah,
excited to be here.
Good. All right, so let's jump right in. I want to lead with talking about the, sort of data privacy, right? So we know that there are already very strong data privacy regulations in Europe, the UK, and other parts of the world. And there's a lot happening from the American standpoint as well. So if you would, walk us through what's going on and what does that mean, not just for video game developers and game studios, but for larger and other industry verticals as well. Tell us about that.
Sure, Matt. So you're right. There's a lot going on right now in the data privacy realm from a regulatory perspective. And the UK has really led the charge, and we're all very familiar with GDPR. In the US, it's interesting that data privacy has been more of a state-led initiative, not a federal one, with 17 states already enacting or have enacted some type of consumer data privacy law. The reality, though, is that we do need a federal standard. It's becoming much too complex for the states to continue to own the privacy question, because companies like the gaming and media industry have to then maintain the regulation on a state level, which means they have to have a different standard for every state they operate in. We recently had a new act introduced for what's called discussion in Congress, which is called the American Consumer Data Privacy Act. It's the first attempt at a federal standard for data privacy. And it's really coming at an opportune time, because while there's 17 states that have current legislation, there's another 18 right now thinking about it or trying to produce it. The interesting thing is that the Consumer Privacy Act will be the first time we've looked at having a federal standard. And while it maintains some of the base legislation that's in the state level, it would be the first kind of sweeping one across the U.S. In addition to that, there's a number of smaller bills being introduced right now, kind of in the same vein, and all of the consumer privacy bills, whether from a children's advocacy perspective or from the data consumer privacy perspective, are bipartisan, bicameral. So we expect at least the act to be introduced into Congress for debate and vote, hopefully this season, but maybe in the next Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I think about it, I think back in 22, when Epic Games actually came to the settlement with FTC, with some of their challenges with Fortnite. The gaming studios are taking it very seriously. It's a big deal for them. And due to the global nature of gaming, it's almost kind of the lowest common denominator, right? So GDPR is right now kind of what they're looking at, is that's what they're going to have to meet if they look at these global releases of the video games.
Well, tell me a little bit more about that, because as I think about kind of the gaming community, increasingly game developers and studios are getting more and more information from users, right? In some cases, these are kids. And I'm thinking about the commerce engines that are in game worlds, the personalization engines that are there, and the sort of broad ecosystems that a lot of the top games create, requiring therefore a lot of personal data to kind of flow into those games, and therefore in the data structures behind the game. So what impact is that having on the way that studios develop games, roll them out, and kind of put them in the marketplace?
Yeah, there was a lot of almost in the early days of gaming's afterthoughts, because you didn't have much in the way of personalization. Now, to your point, Matt, that's a big topic. Another interesting aspect of it is the games are not ephemeral anymore. They last. So you think of like the persistence of like a game like World of Warcraft, where these worlds live on and on. That just takes the requirements for the data security to a new level.
There's another impact that's potentially coming, which is, we mentioned GDPR and European standards. We have DORA coming out as well. And those, interestingly enough, are an opt-in, where you kind of click a button and you actually opt the data into the systems. What's being considered here in the US is an opt-out, where you have the ability to flag to the gaming companies, to media organizations, any consumer-facing company, that you don't want your data included. The issue with that is going to be it's a complete reversal from the UK standard. And so that's going to pose a whole bunch of questions from an impact perspective, how games are released, how media is stored, how data is stored, and then also there's the issue, and you brought it up, about like the online marketplaces and kind of the customization. A lot of that's done by a different subset of companies called data brokers. And as the legislation stands right now, what the ask is that there's basically a button that would allow, a consumer or a parent to opt all of the data out of all the data brokers simultaneously for their children. That's a whole new type of technology that the gaming industry hasn't had to face yet. So it's going to be interesting to watch from a regulatory standpoint, because if the US continues forward in this manner, it will be a complete reversal of what we've dealt with from a GDPR standards perspective.
Well, Kyle, I want to build on this a little bit with you, because I know that, in the gaming community, a lot of players feel like they own the ecosystem that they're a part of, especially in these game worlds that you're talking about that go on, persist for weeks, months, years, and so forth. So to the extent that the gamers feel like they kind of own part of that game world, does that give the game developers a greater sense of responsibility relative to that personal information, or does it sort of make them more lax, or how do they react to that?
No, so there's an interesting concept within gaming of community managers. So think of this as like the relationship manager between the community of players and the game studios, or even down to the individual games. They take it very seriously. They need to make sure that their players are engaged. And I can tell you, the minute something comes up that they don't like, they are some of the loudest voices within entertainment.
Yep, for sure. All right, well, so the regulatory environment is continuing to shift and evolve here in ways that you all have described. Whether we're a client within this vertical or just one of a client more generally, how are organizations planning to evolve with that shifting regulation, and what should they be thinking about to do that effectively?
It's the way to think about it has to do with data. And Kyle, you brought it up. The communities believe they own their experience, and that means to some degree they own the data behind the experience. The reality is, though, that a lot of organizations don't really understand or know holistically where the data goes, how it's being used, how does it impact, and what really is the most critical data for an organization. So the way to kind of get your house in order or to position themselves is to really have an exhaustive understanding of where does critical data reside, what type of data do you need to retain, how would you, if asked, eliminate data, and how can you do that safely? And then who else has a control or a touch on your data, meaning third and fourth party supply chain? What does that look like? So from a cyber perspective, starting to think about holistic resiliency from an operational and a recovery perspective is really the first step to ensure that you'll be able to meet the new regulatory climate.
Yeah, that expectation of resiliency, I think, is important. These games are always on. You think of the concept of live ops. There is no downtime when it comes to these games. So both from the resiliency standpoint and then simple scale, the amount of players that are simultaneously playing these games is mind-boggling for some of them.
Well, and you mentioned, Kate, the idea of kind of getting your house in order. And so I want to build on that a little bit. It seems to me that there's a really big opportunity here. And, Kyle, you talked about the game worlds are running all the time. What's the role of kind of observability technologies in this space relative to kind of the ongoing flow of data in and out of these systems and how it can be protected over time? Like, how does observability play in here?
So actionable observability is a term that we leverage in cyber of really understanding, to your point, where data goes, who touches it, where it lives. The first step as far as getting your house in order is to do an assessment of how do you measure from a base cyber hygiene perspective. Do you have the right tools in place to maintain a basic level of cyber protection? Meaning you have, MFA, you understand what users have access to what data. You limit that in a zero trust mentality where you can to make sure that critical data or personal data, especially when you're dealing with children's data, is being cared for properly. The second piece is really thinking about that resilience journey. So do you understand if there was an impact? What business systems do you need to have maintained? What data do you need to make sure you have backed up in either a vault scenario or some type of a critical backup? And from an observability perspective, do you have the right systems to understand how data transfers and transports across your organization? The issue with a lot of organizations is observability is a point of time. And the reality is that as fast-paced as the gaming industry is, data changes constantly. So having actionable observability that gives you the ability to really understand the movement, the lateral movement, what's going on, both from a horizontal and a vertical perspective, is critical. There's great companies that can do observability on a number of layers, from base level all the way through your SaaS applications. So assessing where you need observability and what aligns with that in a holistic resilience type of an opportunity is I think one of the best first steps in keeping your house in order.
Yeah, it's interesting within gaming, there's so many different game studios. When you think of like the large game studios with a lot of smaller studios underneath, you think of the independent studios, you think of the AA studios. You have everything from a two-person shop to many tens of thousands of people. And then even within the larger shops, some of the smaller studios underneath the umbrella and how they relate into the IT. So to me, there's a lot of just that governance aspect, even just how the organizations relate to one another when it comes to the data protection is a very important conversation.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about, we're capturing a lot of personally identifiable information, PII, and, various other personalization data, and that's just going to increase. So what do you really do to make sure that that's protected?
Well, when you start to think about PII from a protection standpoint, the first thing you do is the first rule of data is you want to understand why and how are you keeping the data. The goal is to keep as little data honestly as possible. And while it's used in things like data brokers and it's very rich and it can be, a great, in essence, source of monetary income in its own right, the first thing to do is think about why are you keeping the data. So take out as much data as humanly possible. For that you have to keep from a protection standpoint, you really want to understand what type of data is it? We talked about PII. From there, it's a question of, do you bring up a data vault? Do you look at doing comprehensive backup and restore? Do you have solutions like Rubrik come in? It's a question of, how long do you need to maintain the data? Is there a regulatory compliance behind it? Is there some type of, from a gaming perspective? And Kyle, you can tell me a lot more than I can on this. Do you need to have the data to keep the game going? Those kinds of things. Is there ability to opt out if a user, or delete the data if the user leaves the platform? But understanding how the data is being leveraged and interacted with is really the first understanding of how you then protect it. From there, you can then look at different options. Again, whether you're going to create a vault, whether you're going to do comprehensive backup, whether you're going to have a hot spare, a cold spare, those are all different options. And it really depends on, again, why you have the data and how fast you need to be able to restore it if there was some type of an issue with data.
Yeah, to Kate's point, right? It comes down to that. What is that minimum amount of data that you can keep to provide value to the player, which is first and foremost for the game studios, and then also from the game studio itself.
This episode is brought to you by Akamai. Akamai's suite of leading cloud computing, security, and content delivery services are helping global companies make life better for billions of people, billions of times a day.
All right, well, I've got to bring artificial intelligence into the conversation because it's on, most of our minds these days. data is kind of the fuel that powers a lot of AI. So if we think about the new regulatory environments that we're living in and how AI is going to sort of feed into that, I'm wondering whether you see any evolutions in terms of kind of data privacy, protection, security, and so forth with respect to how AI will then be consuming that data in the gaming industry going forward.
Yeah, there's a lot coming. I mean, I talk a lot about the fact that I think we're moving into what I call a new era of digital risk. And what digital risk is, it's kind of the collapsing of traditional technology, AI, and cyber risk into kind of its new form of being all together. You're going to see regulations start to push in that direction as well. So we talked about, the American Consumer Data Privacy Act. Also, we have the new AI Act that just came out in the EU. So there's the EU AI regulation. In the US, there's a couple. So we had the AI executive order from the Biden administration. That'll be kind of the precursor to the kind of beginning AI legislation. And right now there's an open call for in the FTC for pending legislation around deepfakes. So we're starting to see the first kind of rumblings of AI legislation and regulatory pressure come in. What's going to happen as we see in the future is you're going to start to see kind of a blend of cyber regulation and AI regulation as AI becomes more and more ingrained in the solutions we have today. We're not going to see AI at the end of the day is still technology. Technology all has a cyber component. So from a regulatory pressure, you're going to start to see, the same type of security controls, data residency controls, breach controls, breach notification happening on AI systems that we already deal with from a cyber perspective. So what I coach companies on is understand where AI lives in your organization. I guarantee AI is in almost every organization today, even if it's in a shadow format. Understand where it lives. How is it being used? Why is it in the organization, either from a cost savings or a market differentiation perspective? And then fundamentally understand that data, because data is where the regulation is going to lie.
Yeah, not all AI is Gen AI. So I think that's an important concept to think about. A lot of the studios that I talk to are very cautious about Gen AI when it comes to the impact on their creators. Their art studios, they're very concerned about how these are going to impact. But there's other aspects of AI from the standpoint of machine learning or some of the machine learning game algorithms. They've been embracing since the very beginning. So I think we just need to be cautious with how we look at AI and not paint it with too broad of a brush.
Okay, you brought up just a great point. That not all AI is Gen AI. And I think sometimes we think, in the world of Gen AI has only been around now for less than 2 years as far as market mainstream. And the legislation and the regulation and how especially the gaming organizations are using it today is more on the robotics and ML side, specifically the ML side. And so understanding that the new regulation and the community of where we're going to head from a legal perspective has to do with all aspects of AI, robotic, ML, and Gen, and that we're still only living in what's called a narrow AI world. We've not gotten yet to general AI. That's a really key distinction as we think about this industry.
Well, if I go off script just a little bit here, I'm curious your point of view, each of you, about the kind of attack profile of the gaming industry in general, or specific game studios or games from a cybersecurity risk standpoint. And then I'm also curious, building on that, do you believe that the rest of the market has things to learn from how gaming companies do this because they're doing real-time games with data all the time? Or are there things that the marketplace, other industries can teach gaming about how to be better with cybersecurity? So I'm curious your points of view on that.
Yeah, I could just chime in from the standpoint of the attack profile for video games from these large multiplayers is massive. When you think about the scale of all the players and think about the communities, and just the slightest thing can kind of trigger some players that many games have seen very large-scale DDoS attacks just for the smallest of infractions from the player community.
So the players themselves are attacking their own game because they are annoyed with something.
That has absolutely happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, there's always been a bit of a symbiotic relationship between the cyber community and the gaming community. A lot of, cyber professionals are actually trained, both from a white hat and a black hat perspective on gamification techniques. Mm-hmm. So there's a counterculture and kind of a quid pro quo between the two industries. So that makes the gaming industry, I think, one of the most in essence, sought after areas from an attack vector perspective. You have a lot of social engineering, you have a lot of phishing. There's, again, to Kyle's point, DDoS attacks on, if somebody doesn't like something. And there's a lot of focus right now on the type of attacks that could happen in the gaming industry, because with social engineering attacks coming in, with a lot of, in essence, population control software being introduced, it's a great, in essence, training ground, almost like a model training for some of these attack vectors. So I think the gaming industry actually is a great kind of beacon for other industries to learn, how do you look and protect your users? How do you think about the community that you're building and ensuring the safety within? We've seen in recent years a lot of, ironically, nation state hacking groups take interest in the gaming industry because they can get the profiles of a wide sampling of a population within those communities. So the data and the information gathered just participating in the gaming communities is something that's quite rich for the hacking community. So I think as we continue forward, social interaction, how AI from a generative perspective starts to get introduced, what the ramifications are, it's an area I think you're going to see a long tail in from a threat vector perspective, because we haven't yet seen a lot of, in essence, new techniques coming out of AI. But I do believe that the gaming industry could be a training ground and something we're going to have to watch very closely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, last question for you both. As you look ahead the coming years, we've talked about data privacy, we've talked about security today. What are 2 or 3 things that you think organizations, gaming or otherwise, will need to keep in mind as they move forward, thinking through these things and the advances that are to come in the next, say, 2 to 5 years? So, Kyle, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, so I will now go to my narrow brush. I think Gen AI is a big one for the gaming studios. When it comes to a big topic is UGC, user-generated content. Mm-hmm. There's a certain limit to scale of the people who are proficient enough in the tool sets to create user-generated content. When you can now get to the point where just type in a text string and have a 3D asset created, it just changes the scale. So I think that's one thing that I'm keeping my eye on.
There's 2 for me, or 3 actually. I think you're going to continue over the next couple of years to see traditional attack vectors, whether it's phishing campaigns, more sophistication around, again, population control. You're going to see attackers really try and leverage new techniques within the community. That's near term. Longer term, there's 2 things that kind of keep me up at night. One is, to Kyle's point, generative AI and specifically deepfake. The fact that there's going to be people in the community that aren't really people and that are being trained to understand the responses of humans in gaming communities. So having to figure out how to handle things like digital watermark, ensuring that the person that you're playing against or communicating with that you think is a human is actually a human, that's something we're going to be dealing with fairly quickly in the gaming industry. The third thing, which we haven't talked about at all, is virtual reality. There is a big concept and a big swell around what we call meta wars and the metaverse, and where gaming heads as far as the blending of virtual reality and traditional gaming community. The concern is that the only true security measure in a lot of VR type technologies is the actual amount of time, processing time for the brain to see what's on and actually compute it. So that's a whole nother area as we get in the next couple of years of the actual cyber safety around VR. And that's something that we could do a whole nother episode on, but those are what keep me up at night.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks to you both. I appreciate you joining us today. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. This is fun. Great conversation.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us as well. Those of you who have joined us, if you like this session, please keep in mind that it's, we've got 3 other episodes in the series talking about media, entertainment, and gaming on AI, cloud, and digital transformation. So check that out. And we've always got lots of great events happening here at Worldwide Technology, episodes that you can watch really at any time. So head to wwt.com/events. Check everything out, see what's coming up, look at the back catalog and watch on demand. And please share any feedback you have with us about today's session. We always like to hear from you. So with that, we'll wrap for today. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.